Chapter 1. The Gardener's Rental House, Ramsgate, Kent, July 1811. "We will return by 4 o'clock," Elizabeth Bennet said to her cousin's governess, and Mrs. Simpson smiled and replied, "Enjoy yourself, Miss Bennet." Elizabeth was certain that she would, and she smiled in response. She stepped out of the door of the rental house and onto the cobbled street with Milly, one of her Aunt Gardner's maids, at her heels. Elizabeth drew in a deep breath of slightly salted air and began marching to the east, toward the sea. The afternoon sun, though well past its zenith, was warm across Elizabeth's back, and she was grateful for the straw bonnet protecting her neck. Milly, striding beside her, reached to adjust her own cotton cap down a little further. The street they were walking along, lined with modest houses, was largely quiet, with only a few other pedestrians out and one carriage that rattled over the cobbles. From the corner ahead and the next street over, the noise of traffic was a little louder, and Elizabeth could see several coaches and carriages ahead crossing through the intersection of a busier thoroughfare. Pedestrians were briefly visible, along with gentlemen on horseback, with small boys and dogs darting along the street. Elizabeth, country-bred as she was more used to the quiet of a neighborhood road, but her interest was piqued by the glimpse of the bustle ahead of them. Her companion seemed rather ill at ease, however, and Elizabeth looked over at the maid. "They will be fine," she said, as she observed Milly turn a worried look toward the house they had left a few minutes previously. "The children are fed and well cared for, with Mrs. Simpson and Agnes to look after them." "Yes, miss," Milly replied. "I'm merely concerned about the mistress. She's so tired, and the children are still not entirely well." Elizabeth sighed and nodded in agreement. She had been invited to spend a few weeks with her relations in London the previous month, and had arrived just in time for illness to invade the gardener's house on Gracechurch Street. Elizabeth had, to the relief of everyone, avoided the influenza which had sickened 3 of her cousins and her aunt, but the last weeks had been exhausting, and the journey from London to Ramsgate had been long, dusty, and tedious. She was thankful to be here at last, and hopeful that before long Mrs. Gardner would recover her full bloom. The children, too, while they had recuperated more quickly than their mother, would benefit from the clean air and cool breezes of Ramsgate on the sea. "I know," she said, "and I am most grateful for your care of her and my cousins. But you are doing me a favour by coming with me, since my aunt is not comfortable with me wandering off by myself." "And she's right, miss," the woman replied firmly. "You are a gentleman's daughter and ought not to be walking alone." Elizabeth sighed, but held her peace. She was accustomed to solitary walks at her family's estate in Hertfordshire, and even in the village of Meryton, which was but 1 mile from Longbourn, her home. It was exasperating to be forced to bring a companion for her walks, but at least Milly was country-bred and able to keep up with Elizabeth's brisk stride. The 2 women turned a corner and came to a simultaneous halt, and Milly exclaimed, "It is wonderful, is it not, miss?" "It is," Elizabeth whispered as she stared in amazement. A wrinkled blanket of blue-green spread out before them, embroidered with white sea-foam atop cresting waves and a golden sun-glitter that no thread could ever truly match. Toy boats glided smoothly and slowly across the blanket, white handkerchief sails billowing out in a stiff breeze too far away for her to feel. Though they looked small from the street, Elizabeth knew that each ship carried dozens of soldiers ready to head for the continent and fight the Corsican tyrant. "It is," Elizabeth repeated a full minute later, and took in another deep, rapturous breath before turning to stroll along the boardwalk which paralleled the sea. A white line wavered across the water, a wave cresting in silent majesty too distant to be heard. A gull skimmed the surface and rose again with its catch, wheeling on the wind to rejoin its companions. Further away, a small splash and a spreading ripple from a fish leaping out of the water. The breeze picked up, tugging at bonnet ribbons and loose curls of hair. The crowds were thicker here, and Elizabeth and her maid found themselves drifting along with the streams of people, many of whom spent no time looking at the brilliant sights of the ocean. Perhaps if one lived here, it was easy to take the sea and sky for granted. She, however, found herself wishing to stop every minute to gaze at the great waters which stretched out to the horizon, deepening as they went. It was wild and free and glorious, and she was suddenly aware of a deep sense of awe for her almighty Father who had made all this. "Let us step in here," she suggested, gesturing at the little wooden platform which extended outward to the ocean. Two other women were already there, bending over a painting easel, but there was plenty of space for Elizabeth and Milly to walk over to the low balustrade and stare out at the endless waves rolling toward them. "It is so big, miss," Milly said. "It looks like it must stretch to the end of the world." "It does look that way," Elizabeth agreed, and sighed. "In truth, it is only some 40 miles to the French coast, where our soldiers are fighting so bravely." Milly nodded, and they were silent for a few minutes, enjoying the wind on their faces and the cries of the gulls circling overhead. Elizabeth felt something ease in her chest. Mrs. Gardner had sickened badly, and there had been a time when Elizabeth had feared for the life of her aunt. But the danger was past, and Ramsgate was far healthier than steamy, smoky London. It was good to be here. "Oh, bother!" a feminine voice exclaimed from her left, and Elizabeth turned in surprise toward the two women sitting at the easel. The younger of the two, a mere girl in her mid-teens, had pale blonde ringlets and blue eyes, and was dressed becomingly in a sprig muslin dress with a chip straw hat on her head. The woman next to her, who looked to be at least 30 years of age, had dark hair and wore simpler garments. A lady and her companion, perhaps. The girl, who had noticed Elizabeth's gaze, flushed miserably and looked down at the ground. Elizabeth hesitated over whether to respond or move away. There was no one to introduce them, but the girl appeared so embarrassed and shy that Elizabeth decided to step forward and smile. "Are you painting? I'm certain it must be very difficult." The girl looked up and managed a wavering smile in return, and the older woman said, "It is, but the most important thing is to keep trying. It is only through practice that one can improve." Elizabeth nodded in agreement, and after a moment of uncertainty gestured at the easel. "May I see it?" The girl bit her lip and bobbed her head, and Elizabeth took a few steps over to look at the painting with interest. Thin charcoal pencil lines sketched over the paper, outlining beach and rocks and sea, along with 3 ships depicted on the ocean's rippled surface. One corner of the painting had started to come alive with color, ranging hues of blue watercolor seeping across the page. It lacked the breathtaking technical skill of the paintings Elizabeth had seen in her father's books, but it was charming and remarkably true for a young lady's sketch. The colors already applied were beautifully vibrant, bringing sky and sea to life. "I think you have done a very fine job with it," she said after a minute, bestowing an approving look on the girl. "I cannot draw at all, and am especially impressed with your depiction of that ship there." The girl looked at the ship in question, and her smile grew wider. "Thank you very much, Miss—" She trailed off, and Elizabeth said, "Miss Elizabeth Bennet from Hertfordshire. I arrived in Ramsgate only today with my aunt and her children." "And I am Miss Georgiana Darcy, and this is my governess, Mrs. Young. It is pleasant to meet you." Matlock House, London. Fitzwilliam Darcy, master of the vast estate of Pemberley in Derbyshire, was annoyed. He had been pleased to receive a dinner invitation from his aunt, Lady Matlock, and had eagerly accepted. His business had occupied his time so fully of late that there had been few opportunities to visit his relations and acquaintances. He had entered Matlock House, and his pleasure had vanished like smoke up a chimney as he observed the drawing-room full of guests. 4 eminently eligible young ladies would be sharing the table with him, along with their parents. He stripped off his gloves, frowning, and executed a perfect bow to his aunt's guests. As little as he liked the situation, he could not be greatly surprised about it. His aunt was an avid matchmaker at the best of times. His cousin, the Viscount, was successfully married through Lady Matlock's machinations, and one of his female cousins, too. Now, with Richard on the continent fighting the French, Darcy had become the object of her matrimonial ambitions. Lady Matlock was determined that her nephew would marry well, and had set out to find him a bride with wealth and connections equal to his own. Thus it was that he found himself seated at dinner next to Lady Diana Barrington, a handsome young woman with a substantial dowry, whose father was a marquis, whom Darcy had met once or twice before. She had come out the previous season, and had not wanted for admirers, but had accepted none of them. Now it seemed Lady Matlock had chosen her as a possible bride for Darcy. Darcy himself was concentrating heavily on the table before him in lieu of Lady Diana's rather dull conversation. Lady Matlock had ordered an expansive dinner, varied and delicious. Beef and pork and fish sat between asparagus and apple pie and white soup and pudding and potatoes and fruit and peas and carrots. He had a portion of ragout on his plate, alongside several vegetables, and was eating steadily. "Of course the weather is dreadfully hot," Lady Diana said in a languid tone as she cut a piece of beef into dainty bits. Darcy shoved a bite of ragout into his mouth and chewed vigorously, even as he shot an indignant look at his aunt. Lady Matlock was immune to glares, though. She merely returned his gaze with raised brows and a slight nod of her head toward Lady Diana. Darcy sighed softly and turned back to the lady in question, who was looking vaguely aggrieved, presumably at his silence. "Yes, it has been hot," he concurred. "Does your family intend to leave town soon?" "I fear not. My father, as you doubtless know, is high up in the government, and—" Lady Diana continued to ramble on at length, obviously intent on boasting about her family's connections and power, while Darcy spoke as minimally as possible without being overly rude. He knew and accepted that Lady Diana was an excellent match. Her father was a marquis, her mother the daughter of an earl, and she herself was well educated and, based on her claims, an excellent performer on the pianoforte and the harp, along with speaking French and Italian with reasonable skill. It said much for Darcy's contrary nature that none of this mattered in the least. Yes, when he chose a wife, he would expect the lady to be accomplished, and while he did not care greatly about Italian, he did believe that any woman worth her salt would love books. But he wanted more than an icy queen who flaunted her abilities some of the time and complained about the weather or the dusty streets the rest. He suppressed a sigh. He was 28 and had been in London for many a season, and still had never met a woman who stirred his heart in the slightest. He was not certain if he ever would, and while he was not so very old, at some point he would absolutely need to marry in order to sire an heir for Pemberley. Was he, perhaps, hoping for too much? He took a sip of wine and composed himself, then turned toward Lady Diana again. Perhaps if he instigated a topic of interest, she would respond. "Do you enjoy Shakespeare?" he asked. "Oh, yes, especially the tragedies. There is so much pathos and sorrow and poignancy. A few months ago I went to a production of King Lear, and the Duke of Sussex was in the audience, you know. Oh, and Lord and Lady Jersey were in attendance as well." Darcy kept his face blank and suppressed a moan. She was dreadfully dull, Lady Diana, and he could not bear to think of marrying her. Unfortunately, he could not bear the thought of marrying any of the women he knew. Chapter 2. The Golden Daffodil Pub, Ramsgate. Footsteps rattled across the sturdy wooden floor of the pub, but George Wickham paid them no mind. A large plate sat in front of him, heaped high with ham sandwiches, the crisp green lettuce and savoury salted meat jammed into still steaming bread. A tankard of ale sat at his right hand, drawn fresh and cool from the cellars. The oak table before him was solid, but rough and unpolished, not at all fit for the godson of George Darcy. But Wickham was long used to gracefully accepting less than his due, as a cold and uncaring world repeatedly denied him his just deserts. He'd been forced to learn how to enjoy even meagre pleasures, such as well-made ham sandwiches. The door opened yet again, and he glanced over idly. Another knot of Navy sailors swaggered in, laughing and jeering amongst themselves. Behind them trailed a pair of privates from the regulars, looking disgruntled and irritated. Doubtless another feud between the army men and sailors who transported them over to the continent, and the sailors appeared to have scored this round. Not a wholesome-looking lot, Wickham thought disdainfully, with their blackened teeth and swarthy skin and permanent sun-squints and strange rolling gait. The soldiers looked far handsomer, with their striking redcoats and neat hygiene and precise military posture. One of the barmaids tripped over to take their order, tittering at the charming smile that one of them turned on her. Wickham drained his tankard, considering he too would look rather striking in a red coat, and though he did not need it to effectively charm smiles from young women, it would certainly not hurt either. But no. He shook his head as he set down the empty tankard. That would not do at all. He was not some mere peasant to be ordered about by puffed-up, foppish second sons. And of course he had seen the men sent home, the ones who had been grievously wounded, men without limbs, missing eyes, or with paralyzed arms and legs. And for all the ones who did come home, hundreds more were buried on continental soil or left to rot, dead beneath the blistering European sun. No, George Darcy's godson was not destined for the army and an ignoble death. The young woman turned away from the privates, and Wickham gestured to her with his empty tankard. She nodded acknowledgment and vanished into the bag, returning shortly with another cup, which she set at his place with a flirtatious smile. He lifted the vessel in one hand in a small toasting motion, grinning in return. His main focus now, of course, must be convincing Georgiana Darcy to elope with him, which would enable him, as her lawfully wedded husband, to control her substantial dowry. But it would take time and careful planning, and he would perhaps have opportunity between chance meetings with young Miss Darcy to tryst with the more comely of the local barmaids. She was a pleasant enough young lady, Miss Darcy, but very young, about 15 years old, without the development or experience he liked in his bedfellows. No, her appeal lay in her dowry, and truly in how furious it would make her brother. Now that was something he could drink to. His teeth ground as he thought of Fitzwilliam Darcy, the author of all of Wickham's troubles. It was unfair, nay, it was cruel and vile that the arrogant, self-righteous son of the kind George Darcy had treated his father's beloved godson so ill. Darcy, who took such pride in his own reputation, had tricked Wickham into accepting a mere £3,000 in exchange for the church living that had awaited him so long, which had been set aside for him by his godfather. Wickham had not imagined how swiftly such a measly sum would be used up, but Darcy had known full well, and had connived to have Wickham sign over the living and consign himself to pennilessness, thus deceiving his childhood playmate without compunction. Wickham smiled grimly over his ale. Darcy would soon reap the bitter rewards of his trickery, and Wickham would finally receive the wealth and easy life that should always have been his. For the rest of their lives, Darcy would be forced to call Wickham brother, while pretty Georgiana shared his bed any time he pleased. He would easily live off of the abundance of £30,000, content in the knowledge that Darcy would never let Georgiana, and, by extension her husband, live in poverty. It was perfect. The gardener's hired house, Ramsgate, 2 hours later. Elizabeth stepped into the drawing-room of the rental house for the first time and looked around curiously. It was pleasing at first glance, long and acceptably wide, done up in elegant blues and greens that soothed the soul, the simple walls empty of any busy paintings. But a second look revealed it to be more shabby than simple. The furniture was out of date and not altogether sturdy. The carpet had visibly worn trails and faded spots from sunlight gleaming in through the thinly curtained windows. The only nod to decoration was a handful of seashells and porcelain mermaids lined up along the mantel. Elizabeth moved to one window, lifting the flimsy curtain to draw the material between her fingers. It would do little to block the light, but she did not mind. She liked the sunlight and thought that it would be beneficial. Moreover, it would not be cold for some months, so that was not a concern. Letting the curtain fall, she glanced over the window itself. The glass was dirty and not terribly expensive, she noted wryly, but it was at least well set in the sash. "I fear it is not a particularly prepossessing house," a familiar voice remarked from behind her, and Elizabeth spun around to observe her aunt standing in the middle of the room, dressed in a fresh blue morning gown which contrasted with her gaunt, weary face. "Oh, it is well enough," Elizabeth said in a bright tone, walking over to a window facing the backyard and looking out. "There is a delightful grassy area with a fence out there, which will be good for the children." "That is one of the reasons why Mr. Gardner chose this house," her aunt said, taking her seat in a wing-backed chair near the dead fireplace, unfurling her fan and using it to create a slight draught in the hope of cooling her face. Elizabeth frowned and turned back to the window. It was terribly hot inside the room, and Mrs. Gardner would benefit from a breeze after her illness. Fortunately, the sash windows could be raised at both ends of the room, and Elizabeth did so, though with some difficulty. The resulting zephyr was very pleasant, much cooler than the inside of the house, and she could smell a hint of salt in the air. "That is wonderful, my dear," Mrs. Gardner remarked, leaning back in the chair and closing her eyes. "Are you well, dear aunt?" "I am well enough," the lady replied, and managed a weary smile. "It is magnificent to be on the seashore at last. I'm thankful especially that the children will be able to enjoy the sea breezes." Elizabeth was privately of the opinion that her young cousins were in far better heart than their mother, but she knew that Mrs. Gardner, a most attentive parent, was more concerned about her children's health than her own. "It will be good for all of us," she said, and took a seat across from her aunt. "How was your walk to the beach earlier, my dear?" "Oh, it was quite marvellous. The winds, the breezes." "Do tell me about it, Lizzie. It may be a few days before I am well enough to venture out of this house, after all." Elizabeth did so, using her extensive vocabulary to express the glorious scenery of the waves and the sky and the sands. Mrs. Gardner listened with interest until Elizabeth mentioned her encounter with the young painter, which caused her to perk up noticeably. "Miss Darcy," the older woman remarked. "How very interesting." "Why is it interesting?" Elizabeth asked. "Oh, well, I doubt that Miss Darcy is a member of the Darcy family in Derbyshire, but when I was growing up as a girl in Lambton, there was a great estate nearby called Pemberley, and the master was Mr. George Darcy." "How great an estate?" "I believe that the estate earned at least £8,000 a year." "Oh," Elizabeth replied. Her own father's estate of Longbourn was worth £2,000 a year, so Pemberley was obviously very grand indeed. She considered the girl she had met earlier in the day. Miss Darcy was dressed very well, but not ostentatiously. It seemed unlikely that she was the scion of such a distinguished family. The nursery, the Gardners' hired house. The next morning. Madeline Gardner stepped over to the northern window of her bedchamber and pushed the curtains apart, which allowed her to gaze at the brick building some 20 feet away. It was not an attractive view, but the Gardners, while financially comfortable, were not rich, and she was grateful that her husband had set aside sufficient funds to allow them this time in Ramsgate. Nor did she particularly care about scenery when she was tired and worn out, not to mention overly emotional after the fatigue and fears of the last weeks. Her maid had left the window open the previous night, and she breathed in deeply the cool air which smelled of the sea. There was a familiar yowl from outside her room, and she hurried out of her chamber toward her precious children who were dwelling in the temporary nursery. She opened the door and stepped in, and for a moment was unnoticed, which gave her time to inspect the room in the bright morning light. The room was at the end of the house, and thus there were windows to the south, north, and east. They were not inordinately large, but they were not small either, and the curtains had been drawn back. The sunlight gleamed along the wooden floors, turning the wood the colour of honey. A cheerful red carpet sat in the very centre of the room, also not large, but soft for the baby to play on. The trunks still sat on the floor, wedged in between the cots that had been set up for the children and Mrs. Simpson. A chest of drawers, its corners chipped, sat half open, with some of the children's clothes already placed inside. A table sat near to the windows, the porridge bowls and plates of eggs set upon it glowing brightly in the sunlight. "Mamma!" cried all 4 children, and Mrs. Gardner, noting with relief that the earlier shout had not portended any sort of crisis, replied, "Good morning, children. I am delighted to see you, but please do eat your meals." "That is excellent advice," Elizabeth said cheerfully as she manoeuvred a bite of sweetened oatmeal into young Benjamin's mouth. The child clamped his mouth over the silver spoon, his eyes twinkling merrily, and it took some effort on Elizabeth's part to get the spoon back from him. "Benji, behave," Mrs. Gardner said with a fond look at her youngest child. Elizabeth grinned and waited for the toddler to finish chewing, and then put another bite into his mouth. "May we join Cousin Lizzie at the beach today, Mamma?" Phoebe asked. "If Lizzie says you may," her mother replied. "Elizabeth, do you want me to finish feeding Benji?" "No, I am enjoying myself," her niece replied truthfully. Elizabeth had grown up in a household where young children were rarely seen and heard as little as possible. Her uncle and Aunt Gardner, while they employed nursemaids and a governess, spent far more time with their children than Elizabeth's mother ever had. "I would be very pleased to take all the children but Benjamin to the beach," she continued, "though I will need some assistance." "Won't come," 1-year-old Benjamin Gardner exclaimed, his lower lip stuck out truculently. "Won't come." "You need your nap, Benji," Elizabeth said gently, leaning over to plant an affectionate kiss on her young cousin's head. "No, no!" the child yelled indignantly, and when he showed no signs of stopping or of eating more, Mrs. Gardner sighed and gestured to Millie, who swooped forward, picked up the baby, and carried him out the door and down the stairs, presumably to let him run about in the garden behind the house. Elizabeth was amused to observe that the older children did not even watch their brother depart. They were accustomed to yelling, apparently. "I presume you do not yet feel well enough to come, Aunt?" No, not yet. Indeed, I will enjoy my nap along with Benji, while you and the children enjoy your time on the beach."